Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Extraordinary Knowing, Science, Skepticism, and the Inexplicable Powers of the Human Mind by Elizabeth Lloyd Mayer, Ph.D. Narrated by Leslie Howard. Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, "You owe me." Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky. Office. Foreword by Freeman Dyson, Institute for Advanced Study, Princeton, New Jersey. This book begins with an extraordinary story about a harp, one that is typical of thousands of others in which somebody knows something without having any normal way of knowing. This kind of extraordinary knowing is commonly called extrasensory perception, or ESP. Since I am a scientist, the story puts me in a difficult position. As a scientist, I don't believe the story, but as a human being, I want to believe it. As a scientist, I don't believe anything that is not based on solid evidence. As a scientist, I have to consider it possible that Elizabeth Mayer and Harold McCoy might have concocted the story, or deluded themselves into believing it. Scientists call such stories anecdotal, meaning that they are scientifically worthless. On the other hand, as a human being, I find the story convincing. I am impressed by the fact that Elizabeth Mayer is herself a scientist and would normally be skeptical of such anecdotal evidence. She understands why the majority of scientists do not believe her story. She is eager to maintain a friendly dialogue between skeptics and believers in ESP. She feels herself, in many ways, closer to the skeptics. But she does not have the luxury of not believing the harp story, because it happened to her, and she knows it is true. I am convinced, not by the story itself, but by the portrait that Elizabeth paints of herself as a scientist, confronting a mystery that orthodox science cannot grasp. The greater part of this book describes the history of ESP research, some of it based on anecdotal evidence and some based on scientific experiments. The Society for Psychical Research, with branches in England and America, has been the main collector and publisher of anecdotal evidence. The Society has been active for more than a century. It has published a large number of well-documented stories in its journal and in a famous book with the title Phantasms of the Living. A phantasm of the living is an episode in which Person A, at a moment of extreme crisis or danger, is seen by Person B, hundreds of miles away. The Society documented these episodes with first-hand testimony from A and B, recorded as soon as possible after the events. The evidence is of very uneven quality, and all of it is anecdotal. The scientific investigations of ESP have been pursued with dogged determination for long periods of time, initially by Joseph Rhine at Duke University, later by Harold Pudoff at Stanford Research Institute, and recently by many other groups. The history of these efforts is murky, partly because there were some accusations of cheating in Rhine's laboratory, and partly because much of Pudoff's work was sponsored by the Central Intelligence Agency under conditions of secrecy. Elizabeth Mayer gives us the clearest accounts of ESP research that I've seen, with an excellent bibliography of relevant documents. The results of the scientific investigations were in the end disappointing. Investigators claim to have positive and statistically significant evidence of ESP, but the positive results were always marginal, large enough to be statistically significant, but not large enough to convince a skeptical critic. There are three possible positions that one may take concerning the evidence for ESP. First, the position of orthodox scientists, who believe that ESP does not exist. Second, the position of true believers, who believe that ESP is real and can be proved to exist by scientific methods. Third, my own position, that ESP is real, as the anecdotal evidence suggests, but cannot be tested with the clumsy tools of science. These positions also imply different views concerning the proper scope of science. If one believes, as many of my scientific colleagues believe, that the scope of science is unlimited, then science can ultimately explain everything in the universe, and ESP must either be non-existent or scientifically explainable. If one believes, as I do, that ESP exists but is scientifically untestable, one must believe that the scope of science is limited. I put forward, as a working hypothesis, that ESP is real, but belongs to a mental universe that is too fluid and evanescent to fit within the rigid protocols of controlled scientific testing. I do not claim that this hypothesis is true. I claim only that it is consistent with the evidence and worthy of consideration. I was asked to write this preface because I published in the New York Review of Books a review of a book about ESP with the title Debunked by Georges Charpak and Henri Broch. Lisby Mayer read my review and refers to it in her Chapter 12. In my review, I said that ESP only occurs, according to the anecdotal evidence, when a person is experiencing intense stress and strong emotions. Under the conditions of a controlled scientific experiment, intense stress and strong emotions are excluded. The person experiences boredom rather than excitement, and so the evidence for ESP disappears. That, I wrote, is why scientific investigation of ESP fails. The experiment necessarily excludes the human emotions that make ESP possible. After my review was published, I received a large number of angry letters in response. Orthodox scientists were angry because I said ESP might be real. True believers in ESP were angry because I said ESP could not be scientifically proved. What I like best about Lisby Mayer is her eagerness, throughout this book, to maintain a friendly working dialogue between believers and skeptics. I'm happy that she and I can disagree and still stay friends. Foreword by Carol Gilligan. I met Lisby over a story of extraordinary knowing, the one she tells in the first chapter of this book. A mutual friend who works in the theater, determined to bring us together, had set up the date and place, a cafe in Harvard Square. I see her across the small wooden table, the coffee cups, packets of sugar ripped open next to her plate, her face lit, her eyes eagerly searching mine. Our friendship would hinge on this conversation. Her daughter's harp had disappeared in Oakland, California. As a last resort, Lisby called a dowser in Arkansas. In recounting his response, she took on his accent, his slow country drawl. All he needed was a map of the city and the light given off by a precious object. There was nothing unusual about this. What was in one framework extraordinary knowing was in another ordinary, matter of fact. I have had the experience many times, thinking of someone I haven't seen for ages and then they call on the phone, knowing something without any way of explaining how I knew. Knowing it viscerally, knowing it intuitively, knowing in a way that challenges long-standing assumptions about separateness and the impossibility of reading other minds. Knowing through connectedness, the word that would join us, bridging Lisby's work and mine. It is how children know, and then when connectedness is shattered or discounted or overridden, they come not to know. The next time I went to San Francisco, I spent an afternoon with Lisby, sitting in her garden. She wanted to talk about Erik Erikson, another link between us. She wanted to talk about the assumptions we make about ourselves and the universe we live in. She wanted to talk about psychoanalysis, physics, music, empathy, Bell's theorem, action, seemingly at a distance, like the pull of the moon on the tides. There were many experiences we shared in common, ranging from our fascination with the figure ground reversals of Gestalt psychology to raising children and running a household. Our conversations extended over the years as we met in Cambridge, Berkeley, Vermont, and the Berkshires, our friendship widening to include our families, circling back to the question, what happens when you shift framework, when you examine seemingly extraordinary events through a different lens? We organized a study group at the psychoanalytic meetings. We taught a seminar together at Harvard, presented together at conferences, ran a writing workshop one Saturday for Radcliffe students. I watched Lisby enliven every scene she entered, inviting enthusiasm, welcoming skepticism, her generosity extraordinary, her curiosity boundless. Ineluctable modality of the visible, Joyce wrote. To Lisby, lines and boundaries could be deceptive. She was drawn to those whose seeing challenged perception, Psychics, card players who knew what was in others' hands, surgeons guided by white light. I had never been interested in ESP, but I am fascinated by what people know, gripped by knowing that seems extraordinary. In our study group, we invited psychoanalysts to share such experiences. Over and over again, the analysts came forward, often shyly, sometimes fearfully, to describe incidents where they or their patients knew something that they had no way to account for. The question of explanation became pressing. At the same time, I was struck by the judgments hedging their revelations, and by the intensity of emotion aroused by these conversations, as if we were breaking a taboo. This book is an invitation to think with Lisby about the inexplicable powers of the human mind, to open ourselves to the possibility, as Hamlet tells his friend Horatio, that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy. The vision is at once stunning and daunting. Once we open the door to mind-matter anomalies, who knows what the rules are? Can minds touch each other in ways that transcend the boundaries of mind and space as we understand them? What if the perceptions we now label extrasensory could be reliably trained to deepen people's ordinary knowing of each other, extending our capacities for empathy and compassion? What if we took possibilities like that seriously enough to subject them to our best scientific scrutiny? This is a book that ends with questions. At the close of my first encounter with Lisby, she handed me 2 cards. One identified her as a psychoanalyst, the other as director of San Francisco Bay Revels, the Christmas Revels, which began in Cambridge, and she then took to the West Coast, is a celebration of the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, the moment when the earth turns back toward the light. Extraordinary knowing, written by someone with one foot in the arts, the other in science, captures a hope common to both, of finding light in darkness. I took Lisby's 2 cards and placed them in my wallet. Carol Gilligan is the author of In a Different Voice and, most recently, The Birth of Pleasure. She is university professor at New York University. 1. The Harp That Came Back. My Journey Begins. In December of 1991, my daughter's harp was stolen. We got it back, but it came back in a way that irrevocably changed my familiar world of science and rational thinking. It changed the way I go about living in that world. It changed the way I perceive the world and try to make sense out of it. This book is about what unfolded as I attempted to explain what happened. I encountered questions, huge and disconcerting questions about the world as we know it. They held radical import not just for science, but for the ways we live our everyday lives. This is a book about those questions, and some of the surprising answers I encountered along the way. In 1991, I was teaching in the psychology department of the University of California at Berkeley, and at the University Medical Center in San Francisco. I was doing research on female development and seeing patients in my psychoanalysis practice. I was a member of numerous professional associations, doing committee work, attending international meetings, functioning on editorial boards, and lecturing all over the country. I was a training and supervising analyst in the American Psychoanalytic Association. I was busy and fulfilled, and life was running along the way it does. My 11-year-old daughter, Meg, who'd fallen in love with the harp at age 6, had begun performing. She wasn't playing a classical pedal harp, but a smaller, extremely valuable instrument built and carved by a master harp maker. After a Christmas concert, her harp was stolen from the theater where she was playing. For 2 months, we went through every conceivable channel trying to locate it. The police, instrument dealers across the country, the American Harp Society newsletters, even a CBS TV news story. Nothing worked. Finally, a wise and devoted friend told me, if you really want that harp back, you should be willing to try anything. Try calling a dowser. The only thing I knew about dowsers were that they were that strange breed who locate underground water with forked sticks. But according to my friend, the really good dowsers can locate not just water, but lost objects as well. Finding lost objects with forked sticks? Well, nothing was happening on the police front, and my daughter, spoiled by several years of playing an extraordinary instrument, had found the series of commercial harps we'd rented simply unplayable. So, half embarrassed but desperate, I decided to take my friend's dare. I asked her if she could locate a really good dowser. The best, I said. She promptly called the American Society of Dowsers and came back with the phone number of the society's current president, Harold McCoy, in Fayetteville, Arkansas. I called him that day. Harold picked up the phone, friendly, cheerful, heavy Arkansas accent. I told him I'd heard he could dowse for lost objects, and that I'd had a valuable harp stolen in Oakland, California. Could he help locate it? "Give me a second," he said. "I'll tell you if it's still in Oakland." He paused then. "Well, it's still there. Send me a street map of Oakland and I'll locate that harp for you." Skeptical, but what, after all, did I have to lose? I promptly overnighted him a map. 2 days later, he called back. "Well, I got that harp located," he said. "It's in the second house on the right on D Street, just off L Avenue." I'd never heard of either street, but I did like the sound of the man's voice, whoever he was. And I don't like backing down on a dare. Why not drive to the house he'd identified? At least I'd get the address. I looked on an Oakland map and found the neighborhood. It was miles from anywhere I'd ever been. I got in my car, drove into Oakland, located the house, wrote down the number, called the police, and told them I'd gotten a tip that the harp might be at that house. Not good enough for a search warrant, they said. They were going to close the case. There was no way this unique, portable, and highly marketable item hadn't already been sold. It was gone forever. But I found I couldn't quite let it go. Was it the dare? Was it my admiration for the friend who'd instigated the whole thing? Was it my devastated daughter? Or was it just that I had genuinely liked the sound of that voice on the other end of the line? I decided to post flyers in a 2-block area around the house, offering a reward for the harp's return. It was a crazy idea, but why not? I put up flyers in those 2 blocks, and only those 2 blocks. I was embarrassed enough about what I was doing to tell just a couple of close friends about it. 3 days later, my phone rang. A man's voice told me he'd seen a flyer outside his house describing a stolen harp. He said it was exactly the harp his next-door neighbor had recently obtained and showed him. He wouldn't give me his name or number, but offered to get the harp returned to me. And 2 weeks later, after a series of circuitous telephone calls, he told me to meet a teenage boy at 10:00 p.m. in the rear parking lot of an all-night Safeway. I arrived to find a young man loitering in the lot. He looked at me and said, "The harp?" I nodded. Within minutes, the harp was in the back of my station wagon, and I drove off. 25 minutes later, as I turned into my driveway, I had the thought, this changes everything. I was right. The harp changed how I work as a clinician and psychoanalyst. It changed the nature of the research I pursued. It changed my sense of what's ordinary and what's extraordinary. Most of all, it changed my relatively established, relatively contented, relatively secure sense of how the world adds up. If Harold McCoy did what he appeared to have done, I had to face the fact that my notions of space, time, reality, and the nature of the human mind were stunningly inadequate. Disturbing as that recognition was, there was something intriguing, even exciting about it as well. Over the ensuing months, I spent a lot of sleepless nights. I argued with myself a lot. I regularly woke up at 3:00 a.m., certain that with just a little more effort, a little more clear thinking, I'd come up with some comfortably rational way to explain how that harp had ended up back in my living room where it belonged. Finally, a friend of mine, a statistics professor at Berkeley, listened to my conflicted ranting and said in exasperation, "Get over it and get some sleep, Lisby. As a statistician, I can promise you the odds that dowsing works are a lot greater than the odds that this could have been coincidence." I decided it was time to consider what it might mean if I started taking the whole thing seriously. What if, I began wondering, what if I stopped trying to explain it all away, but instead tried to consider how on earth a dowser, over the phone and from 2,000 miles away, could pinpoint the exact location of my stolen harp within the vast metropolitan San Francisco Bay Area? I began to look into the scientific evidence for dowsing. That quickly led to reports from some very respectable scientific minds about all kinds of other, possibly related anomalous phenomena. I was discovering a vast, strange new territory of research regarding anomalous mind-matter interactions. Interactions between mind and matter that simply cannot be contained inside what we call normal science. Of course, I also discovered that the world of anomalous mind-matter interactions is filled with shoddy research, flaky research, and research based on questions that are neither particularly interesting nor rooted in a solid grasp of science, scientific method, or scientific thinking. Yet, as I delved more deeply, what most impressed me was the significant bank of well-conducted, scientifically impeccable research that imposes enormous questions on anyone interested in making sense of the world from a Western scientific point of view. I began to wonder, why had so much of this excellent research been overlooked, its conclusions dismissed? Weeks after I'd published my first tentative foray into exploring mind-matter anomalies, a physician I barely knew came up to me at a professional meeting. He'd read my article and wanted to tell me something. The story poured out. He'd been diagnosed 20 years earlier with fatal bone cancer and had become deeply depressed. As a marathon runner, he'd found relief from despair only while he ran. Early one morning, 2 hours into his run, he'd been suddenly overcome by what he described as a sensation of light, clear, soft light, as though light was filling my bones, as though light and air were infusing each bone. I saw it, light penetrating those bones, right through to the marrow. The next week his x-rays were clean. "I've never told another colleague," he said. "I told my wife when it happened, no one else. And this part I didn't tell anyone. I know that's what cured me. The light crowded out the cancer cells. I don't know how, but I know it did." As word of my new interest spread, my medical and psychoanalytic colleagues began to inundate me with accounts of their own anomalous experiences, personal as well as clinical. As with the physician, the stories they shared with me were often ones they'd never reveal to another professional associate. Their accounts, by email, snail mail, at conferences and seminars, in hall corridors, or at dinner, made as little sense to me as they did to the colleagues telling me about them. The stories were all about knowing things in bizarrely inexplicable ways. My patient walked in, and I knew her mother had died. No clues. I just knew, instantly. I woke up in the middle of the night like I heard a shot. The next day, I found out it was exactly when my patient took a gun and tried to kill herself. I suddenly felt that my partner's son was in trouble. I called my partner. It worried him enough that he tracked down his son. His son had been in a bad car accident, and my partner got there just in time to make a decision about surgery that probably saved his life. I was particularly fascinated by how eagerly my colleagues shared even the most weirdly personal stories with me. Their eagerness puzzled me until I realized how badly people wanted to reintegrate corners of experience they'd walled off from their public lives for fear of being disbelieved. I was on a bus and all of a sudden found myself smelling the perfume my brother's ex-wife used to wear. When the bus stopped, she got on. I hadn't smelled that perfume or seen her in 30 years. My husband and I fell in love with a house in London on our honeymoon, very distinctive, across from a park. 14 years later, living in Boston, I woke up one day and thought, maybe we could buy it. I tracked down a realtor in London, asked if she could figure out the address and find out if it was for sale. Crazy. But she did. The man who'd been living there had just died. The for sale sign wasn't even up yet. We bought it the next week. I began taking notes, word for word and with every detail I could catch. I couldn't figure out what else to do. I couldn't ignore the things people were telling me, but I couldn't find ways to make sense of them either. The stories were from credible people, backed up by enough hard facts that I couldn't reject them out of hand. As my files of all these notes grew, I found myself pursuing the odd, unexpected conversation with a new kind of curiosity, not just with colleagues, but also with friends, students, and even first-time acquaintances. I began asking different questions. Someone would mention an unusual outcome of a friend's illness. Instead of letting it pass, I'd ask what was so unusual. In return, I'd often hear accounts of apparently anomalous healing or treatment or even diagnoses. Perhaps a stranger delivering an accurate, complex diagnosis of a medical condition over the phone without any background information. Or someone would describe knowing something, but having no idea how they knew it, and I'd probe gently. Peculiar stories would follow. A woman wakened by a sudden ache in her chest, just as her father suffered a heart attack 3,000 miles away. A man assaulted by shooting leg pain at the moment an identical twin fractured his leg. A student instantly guessing to 4 decimal places the exact strength of a chemical solution that should have taken hours to work out. A mother seized by panic at the exact moment her baby across town took a bad fall. My new focus also encouraged me to tune into my patients in a new way. I gradually had to face the realization that there were things my patients had been only half telling me for years. Things they viewed as too weird or risky to reveal for fear I wouldn't believe them, or, worse, would think they really were crazy. Now, when my patients began to hint at strange incidents, odd images, or funny coincidences, I worked harder to encourage them to explore their meaning, and I began hearing some remarkable things. I was somewhat stalled with one deeply troubled patient, a woman who was isolated and very frightened of the world. For years, she'd insisted she couldn't remember any of her dreams, and indeed, she'd reported almost none to me through our work together. Then, during one session, she told me that the night before, she'd dreamed of my going to Arizona. I had indeed been planning a trip to Arizona that week, but I'd told none of my colleagues or patients about it. I asked her, why Arizona? She had no idea, no associations. I told her that I was in fact going to Arizona, and wondered if she'd somehow pick that up. For a moment, she was quiet. Then she hesitantly told me that she often had dreams in which she knew where people were going, and it turned out she was right. She couldn't begin to explain it. She'd learned not to tell people. It was too weird. She had had dreams like that as a child, and her parents had raged at her and called her crazy. They would sometimes beat her until she said she'd made it all up. So she'd learned to shut up and start pretending that she didn't have dreams, that a lot of things she experienced weren't real. Pretending to others, to herself, had made her feel safe, but it had also made her feel that she wasn't very real. That exchange with my patient was a turning point in her psychotherapy. It was also a turning point for me. My evident curiosity about her dream had liberated a flood of experiences. As my patient started believing that I could believe her, and considered her neither crazy nor dangerous, a new world opened up between us. She began for the first time telling me about other bizarrely intuitive experiences, and about how they terrified her. Bit by bit, her comfort in the world took a new root. Her life changed in profoundly positive ways. She told me that she started feeling she could be real. My patient's fear of being unable to credit the evidence before her eyes, of being thought crazy, of losing the comfort of being believed, began to take on an enormous resonance for me. I still wanted to make sense of my own experience with the harp, but I also wanted to understand more about why our culture is so fearful about anomalous experiences. Could this be why so much well-conducted research in the United States hasn't been given more attention? Was it the nature of that discomfort and the conflicts that underlie it? What does our collective and individual fear of these unknowns cost us? How might we start to relieve that discomfort while working to resolve the conflicts? And, very important to me, is it possible to investigate apparently anomalous experiences while remaining firmly grounded in rational thought. I dearly value the rational world and all it enables, while facing the awareness that it's a world with no room.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?